Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of Trailblazer DX. Hope everybody's enjoying things so far, and it's great to see everyone here. I am Tom Leddy. I am the product director for Well-Architected Decision Guides, and this is our session. It's a sneak peek at what is next for decision guides. And before we get started, we've got our forward-looking statement, and it's funny, sometimes I'll make a joke about this slide because it's in every Salesforce presentation, but in this one, I actually am going to be giving some forward-looking statements about the guides themselves and potentially even some of the products that are going to be in them. So make sure that you are making purchasing decisions based on what's actually for sale and having those discussions with your AE and not on anything that I'm going to say here. And wanted to give you all a quick thank you for coming out, and for everybody watching on Salesforce Plus as well. Thanks for tuning in. And quick question, so for people that are here live, how many people have seen decision guides on architect.salesforce.com before? Quick show of hands, okay? About half. And how many people knew, of the people that put your hands up, how many people knew that decision guides were part of the well-architected framework? A few less, and there's actually a reason for that. So up until about a month or so ago, they actually weren't. And one of the reasons that I'm here talking about this, and I'm actually in the role that I'm in now, which is a brand new role, is because my colleague Susanna and I and a few other people on our team spent the last maybe 18 months or so since we launched the Well-Architected framework going around doing enablement and having listening sessions with architects about what tools are you using, what do you like about Well-Architected, what could be better. And we kept getting this feedback that it would be great if Well-Architected contained product comparisons and ways to determine what tools to use in what scenarios. And we had these decision guides that were available on architect.salesforce.com, but we considered them to be a completely separate tool that weren't really part of the Well-Architected framework. So we would have this answer of, oh, well, you should go look at the decision guides. And we got such an overwhelming amount of feedback about that we decided to bring them all together and make them a little bit more tightly integrated with the actual Well-Architected framework. So I know there have been a couple other presentations that you may have seen throughout TDX about Well-Architected. Decision guides are now part of that overall Well-Architected umbrella. So you're going to be seeing tighter integration with other parts of the framework. And why are decision guides important? So I'm going to actually answer that by telling you a little bit of a story about a project that I worked on before I was a Salesforce employee. There was a time when I was working with a very large public sector project. It was a very large US city, and they were replacing their non-emergency call center with Salesforce with Service Cloud. And the city being as big as it is, if you think about all the different types of things you could call a city for that are not an emergency, so maybe there's a pothole in front of your house, or there's a street light that's out, or a water main break, or anything else, all of those calls have to get routed to different departments. And each one of those departments has its own budget and actually has its own IT systems that have to then process those requests. So I had to figure out how to integrate a single Salesforce org to 150 different back-end systems that were all built at different times and supported different types of integration methods. So some of them were more modern. I could use REST APIs. Some of them required batch integration. Some of them were still file-based transfers. And I didn't know what tools to use. Every time I would look at the Salesforce product documentation, it looked like there were like 3 or 4 different tools that all kind of did the same thing, and I wasn't sure why I would pick one versus another. And so what I ended up doing was taking months to read blog posts and Google things and try to make assumptions based on what I thought it said in the product documentation about why I would want to use one tool in one scenario. And that was before we could even start doing any design work because we still hadn't even selected the right tools yet. And I ended up with a big spreadsheet that I had manually cobbled together. I made a bunch of assumptions. Were those assumptions good ones? Well, I hope so. I mean, we ended up building it and it was successful, but there would have been a lot easier way to do that if we had a guide that actually provided some side-by-side comparison of these tools. So, understanding the options and trade-offs like that is going to help you make sure that you have a higher return on investment because you know that you're building the right tool, you're using the right tools for the right job in the first place. That's going to make it easier to maintain. When we think about the rest of the well-architected framework, we talk about patterns and anti-patterns and making sure that you're designing things the right way. Well, before you even design something the right way, you have to make sure you're even designing the right thing and using the right tool to do that design work in the first place. And then, that longer-term business value. If you've got the right mix of tools, you're going to be less likely to have to re-architect something later. So the Salesforce platform, as you know, over the last few years, it's continued to expand. We're talking about things like Data Cloud and Hyperforce now. And it can be even more difficult to make the right decisions as the platform continues to grow. So we want to make sure that as part of the well-architected framework, you also have the right information that you need to make the right choices. So decision guides they're product comparisons for feature fit guidance, and the information in the decision guides comes from our product teams and subject matter experts throughout Salesforce. So if you saw in the first slide, yeah, it's my title is product director for decision guides, and it's my job to curate all of this information and format it in a way that it's easy to consume. But it is actually our product teams that are providing the information about their products. And so if you look at the screenshot here, we can see this is from a record-triggered automation guide. It's a table comparing low-code versus pro-code options for these different types of record-triggered automations you can build. The boxes that say not ideal for under Flow, for example, it's actually our Flow product manager that provided this information and said, yeah, you know what, we did some testing. In this specific scenario, you could use Flow to do this, but Apex is actually a better option. So that's why it says not ideal, and then the reverse is true for Apex as well. So this is our team, myself going through and curating all this information, working with those product managers and SMEs within Salesforce that have implemented these things in the field, and they know what all the gotchas are. So decision guides are also guidelines for product and investment changes. So when we talk about when a product is going to be end of life, so also in our record-triggered automation guide, we know that, for example, workflow rules and process builder are going away, but what does that really mean for you, and what tools should you be looking at instead? So we'll find that type of information in a guide also. And they also contain detailed technical information. So these guides are meant for architects and people that are actually implementing Salesforce solutions. They're not meant to be sales tools. You're not going to find pricing information or licensing information. It is just pure technical comparisons for the information that you need to know to be successful. And what decision guides are not, so like I just said, they are not buyer's guides. So if you are interested in how much something is going to cost or what type of licenses you need to use a specific tool, that's still a conversation that you're going to want to have with your account executive. They're not implementation or configuration guides because the idea is you can go into the product documentation and find that information. What we want to do is make sure that you're configuring the right tool up front before you go and start to look at how to configure it. And when it comes to general architecture guidelines, there are still the patterns and anti-patterns that are available in the well-architected framework on the Salesforce Architects website. These are going to be, like I said, more tightly integrated with those, but there is decision guides are specifically those tool comparisons and making sure that you're finding the right tools for the right job. And our current decision guides, so we've got 4 of them. We've got a guide that covers event-driven architecture, and I'm actually going to walk through a couple of these in a minute. And that's about how to produce and consume events asynchronously, or efficiently. So if you're thinking about sending data to another system or even within Salesforce asynchronously, based on platform events, change data capture, those types of tools, those are covered in the event-driven architecture guide. Also the data integration guide, so synchronizing and sharing data between Salesforce and external systems. That's the guide that when I was working on the public sector project I mentioned earlier would have been super helpful if it had been available at the time. Building forms, there are a ton of different ways to build forms within the Salesforce platform. There has never really been a standard way, so knowing what the right what the right tool to use is, based on even things like low code versus pro code. And you'll actually see this in a lot of the decision guides because one of the decision points that you need to be thinking about as you're building a solution out is who is going to be maintaining this over the long term? Do I have a development team? Do I need to hire developers? Or do I need to think about a more low code tool that is going to be easier for somebody even without developer skills to be able to maintain? And then we've also got our record triggered automations guide, which is around performance and design considerations specifically for record-triggered automations. And so the anatomy of a decision guide. So every one, I will say, of the 4 that we have, every one of them is a little bit different. But what we have at the beginning up front, we've got the overview of the guide itself. So what is this actual topic about? Why do you care if you're an architect? And then after that, we've got our key takeaways, which is a bulleted list of the key considerations you need to think about when you're using the guide. And I like to think of this, it's kind of like the TLDR for the guide itself, because I'm going to open one of these guides up in a minute, and you're going to see that some of them are like 45-minute reads, or they're really super long. And if you need to compare two products or just make a choice, or understand why you should even be making this choice in the first place, you probably don't have time to go through and read the entire guide. So up at the top, you're going to find a quick summary of, well, what do I really need to know if I learn nothing else while I'm looking at this guide? And then we've got our comparison table, which features all of the tools in the guide side by side, and something that I actually meant to mention on the last slide. So we've got 4 guides. Across the 4 guides, you'll find comparisons of about 50 different Salesforce tools for the different scenarios that we talk about in each guide. And then we'll have characteristics that are common to all of the tools in the guide. And then under that, there is a repeating list of the different scenarios. So how do you solve a specific business problem using the tools that we're covering in the guide? And what are the comparisons of the tools, the subset of tools in that guide that are relevant to that specific scenario, and how do they compare to each other? And that's where you can really dig in and make your choice of, I want to choose this tool because it has a longer replay period for event-driven iterations, for example, versus this other one that maybe it has a shorter replay period, or I don't get to design my own payload. And we'll take a look at what that means in a second. In fact, we're going to take a look at what that means right now. Let me switch over, and we're going to look at a decision guide. And we can find these, like I mentioned earlier, they are on the Salesforce Architects website. So if you haven't seen this, it is architect.salesforce.com. And you can see we've got our well-architected framework. We've got a few other tools that there are other sections about here. So diagrams is one, and then decision guides. And if I were to click this, I can say see all guides, and we can see the 4 that I just mentioned, and I'm going to click into event-driven architecture, just because it's the first one, but these are all fairly similar. You'll get a similar experience when you look at these. And we can see over on the right-hand side, we've got our menu that we can get to things quickly, but at the top, we've got our overview. So what is event-driven architecture? And as an architect, why is this something you need to be thinking about? Why do you even need to make decisions about this in the first place? Our key takeaways, we can see that when you should use approaches that use event, or when you should prefer approaches that use event-driven architectures. You should see that if MuleSoft is part of your existing landscape, use it where possible, as opposed to building point-to-point integrations. Using the pub/sub API for these types of patterns. And then high-volume platform events are the preferred mechanisms for field changes that need to be consumed by other systems. So these are a few things that you need to know. And then as we scroll down, we can see all of the list of tools that we're going to be comparing throughout the guide are listed here. And this is a short table that kind of just talks about whether you need coding skills or not. But we're going to go a little bit deeper into what those specific differences are between those tools at a more granular level. We've got a list of the patterns that we're going to be covering. And then we're going to walk through each one of those patterns. So what does the publish-subscribe pattern look like? One of the other nice features of this particular guide is that this has got a diagram. This is already integrated with our Salesforce diagram framework, because you can download this diagram as a PDF, or you can actually open it in Lucidchart and fill it in. If you're building this out for your organization or for a customer, if you're a consultant, you can actually use this as a template and just fill it in with the actual relevant systems for the project you're working on. And when we scroll down a little bit more, we can see that now we can actually see the tools that are specifically relevant to this pattern. And we can see that we've got a lot more information in this table than what we saw in the previous table that just had an overall comparison of all the tools. So we can look at what are the required skills. Do you need developers to build this? How do you publish? How do you subscribe? How long is the replay period? And what does your payload structure look like? Can you define your own payload structure, or does the system actually define it for you? And we can scroll over and we can see things about like limits and some other information that you're going to want to be able to look side by side in these tables and actually say, okay, now I have the information I need to be able to actually choose one of these tools in a way that feels like I'm not just going and cobbling a bunch of information together off of the internet and then hoping that I'm making the right choices. And so that is what that guide looks like. All of the other ones have a similar format. And then one of the other things that we'll get to down towards the end of the guide, we have some other information about just overall considerations that you're going to want to think of related to this topic. So how to design good events. Once you've selected a tool, how do I know that I'm using it the right way? And then you can go from there into the patterns and anti-patterns within well-architected to get even more granular information about what good actually looks like and what you should be looking for when using these tools. And what's next? So, like I said, I'm in this role that I've been in for about a month, and one of the things that I've been thinking about is, what do we actually want to do with these? We know these tools are valuable. They've been on our site for a few years. We always get feedback. Every time we would go to talk about well-architected, we would have people that would want to talk about decision guides because they're super useful tools. So how can we make them better, and how can we make them more valuable for you to use them? And what we've got is a few things. So one thing we're going to do is expand the depth of the decision guides, which means the existing guides, we're going to start to see more products. So things like Data Cloud and Flow Orchestrator and Omni Studio. Data Cloud is already in our data integration guide. It's going to be added to some of the other ones where it's relevant. Flow Orchestrator, we need to add to our record triggered automation guide. And then Omni Studio also, it's in our building forms guide, needs to be in the record triggered automations guide as well. And then we'll have more patterns and scenarios. So each guide has about 10 of them now, but we know that there are some existing ones that we can add. And then there's breadth, so wide. So we're going to be adding additional guides. So in addition to the 4 decision guides that we have today, we already know from talking to our internal engineering team that people have issues already with asynchronous processing. So if you pick the wrong patterns when you're setting up custom objects, for example, even something as simple as choosing whether you want an auto number or a name field when you create the object can lead to performance issues if you don't make the right choice. And it's not really well documented about when you should be making which choice. And there are a whole bunch of other decisions like that that our database team internally has been making an internal list of over the last few years that hasn't really been documented publicly. We're going to work on getting that information out for you that'll make it easier for you to make those decisions, even when working within the platform. And then org strategy and data strategy. This is another one that, for me, has a lot of meaning because for a while, I worked for a global consumer products company that was in a heavily regulated industry. And in fact, it was a beer company. And when you think about liquor laws in the US versus liquor laws in Europe versus Asia, everything is so different, and the processes that support being able to comply with those laws are different. So it took me months to come up with the right org strategy for this company. And at the time, some of these tools that we have available now, like Hyperforce and Data Cloud, weren't even available yet. So when we think about org strategy, what it meant a few years ago compared to what it means today, now there's a whole other element of data strategy that's part of that we need to make sure people are thinking about. And in fact, the nice thing about being at TDX, and we've got a lot of product managers here, I am actually meeting later today with the product director for Hyperforce to have this discussion about how do we get started with this. And then there's some Data Cloud team members here that I'm meeting as well. So that guide will be coming later this year as well. And then deeper integration with the Salesforce well-architected patterns and anti-patterns, and then the other Salesforce diagramming framework also. So there's going to be a lot more consistent flow back and forth between all of these different tools that are available on the Salesforce Architects website. And the other thing is, I want your feedback as well. So all of the things that I just talked about on the last slide that we're going to do are based on internal feedback that we've gotten from other teams at Salesforce that we know are required. But I would love to hear what you're doing. If anybody that raised your hand about using decision guides in the past, would love to hear where they're working for you, what else you would like to see in them, any other guides that you'd like to see besides the other 2 that I just mentioned. There are a couple ways. You can either get in touch with me directly by using my email address right here. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and reach out to me. Would love to have a conversation. And the biggest thing I want to do is make sure that these guides are even more valuable than that they already are, and they're helping you do your job efficiently and be successful. And with that, I want to say thank you to everybody. Thanks for coming. And like I said, let's keep the conversation going and stay in touch.